There is a precise moment in life when fear ceases to be an invisible monster and becomes a tangible cage. Do you remember the day you realized that everything, absolutely everything, was conditioned by that silent force? The fear of failing, of being judged, of disappointing. The fear that made you obey orders that no one pronounced, that made you live in the margin of your own history. That fear that, disguised as prudence, taught you to ask permission even to breathe louder than others. But what happens when you suddenly choose not to obey anymore? What happens when you decide to stop being a victim and dare to look your own inner executioner in the eye? Most live and die in that margin, obeying invisible instructions, justifying their inertia with responsible adult excuses. Because it is more comfortable to blame the world, the others, the past, than to assume the horror of one's own cowardice. But today here the mask falls. It is you who feeds the cage. It is you who holds the key. Fear in reality never had the power. Only you, with every renunciation, with every I can't, with every I mustn't, whispered in the mirror, gave it form and authority. Now stop. Look around. How many opportunities did you let pass you by out of fear? How many times did you postpone your voice, your desires, your ambitions, waiting for permission to come from outside? This is not a great mystical revelation but a brutal confession. Your life was, until today, a succession of small surrenders. Every time you kept silent when you should have spoken up, every time you accepted less than you deserved, every time you lowered your head to avoid conflict, you chose to be the victim of your own fear. But there is one day, just one, when something breaks. One day when the pain of continuing to obey is greater than the terror of rebelling. On that day the strategy begins. Not because the fear disappears, but because you decide to stop letting yourself be dominated. Because you understand that freedom is not a gift. It is a conquest, an internal war, a daily decision to disobey the voice that wants you to be small, submissive, absent. Do not deceive yourself. It is not a heroic leap, nor a glorious epiphany. It is a whisper, a discomfort that becomes a silent cry. Enough. Thus begins the transformation. So begins the journey from victim to strategist. But the real question is, do you dare to take the first step, or will you continue to justify your fear with the usual alibi? Pause. Take a breath. Look fear in the face even if your voice trembles. Today you decide if the cage remains closed, or if at last you dare to force the lock. Do you know why fear is so efficient as a jailer? Because it doesn't scream. It whispers. It camouflages itself as wisdom, prudence, unquestionable logic. It's not the time, don't make waves, better shut up so you don't take risks. These are phrases you learned to utter before you even understood their true purpose. Fear settles first in your language, then in your gestures until it ends up colonizing your daily decisions. And the most perverse thing, it convinces you that obeying it is a sign of intelligence, when in fact it is the most sophisticated form of self-deception. But the day comes when the discomfort of submission becomes unbearable. You begin to notice how your life has become filled with absences, opportunities not taken, words never spoken, desires postponed into oblivion. You discover that every time you gave in to fear, something inside you shut down. And then the first act of rebellion occurs, questioning the legitimacy of that fear. Where does it really come from? Who does it serve? What part of you benefits from being kept shrunken, invisible, irrelevant? Fear, when stripped bare, reveals its true nature. It is a control mechanism. Not just external but deeply internal. It is the inherited voice of those who taught you not to stand out, not to risk, not to challenge the established order. It is the echo of an education where punishment was more certain than reward, where applause was always for the docile, never for the audacious. The more you analyze it, the clearer you see that fear made you functional but never free. And here arises the germ of strategy. Because it is not enough to identify the enemy, you have to learn to use it. The strategist does not eliminate fear. He studies it, embraces it, transforms it into energy for progress. He begins to ask himself, how can I use this fear as a radar, not as a chain? At what point does my fear signal a boundary that must be crossed, precisely because it terrifies? The day you decide to stop obeying fear, it is not because you stop feeling it but because you stop idolizing it. The initial tactic is simple but radical. Defy every internal command that comes from fear. Don't obey immediately. Pause. Question, investigate, break down the command until you discover whether it is based on a real threat or a programmed reflex. Most fears do not resist the autopsy of consciousness. This is where the transition begins. From victim to strategist. From obedient to architect of your destiny. The fear will still be there, you know. But for the first time it will not be the master. It will be, at most, an uncomfortable advisor whose voice no longer decides for you. At this crucial point, the transition from victim to strategist is no longer just a wish, but a series of concrete acts. You begin to notice how every decision, every word and every silence, can be used as a piece on your personal chessboard. Fear, that old ally of conformity, now becomes your most accurate source of information. It detects threats, reveals limits and points out the places where you need to grow. What used to paralyze you now alerts you. Fear ceases to be a command and becomes a strategic signal. This is where awareness becomes your most powerful weapon. Every time fear appears, you examine it with surgical distance. What is it trying to protect? What past history is it trying to revive? What part of your identity is it anchored in? The strategist knows that behind every fear is a belief, a memory or an unresolved wound. He does not shy away from fear. He interrogates it, disarms it, uses it. Because only those who know their fears can turn them into energy for action, into an impulse to cross frontiers that once seemed insurmountable. Now, every time you feel that knot in your stomach, you don't go backwards. On the contrary, you take a step forward. It is not blind courage, but lucid tactics. Fear is the map of what matters most to you and also of what limits you the most. If you learn to listen to it without obeying it, you discover doors where before you only saw walls. Thus, fear ceases to be a cage and becomes a compass. How far can you go when you stop running away and start moving towards your own limits? But beware, the environment is not always ready for your metamorphosis. Those who prefer to see you submissive will try to remind you of your old chains. They will accuse you of arrogance, of insensitivity, of having become cold. This is not true. You have simply stopped obeying the voice of fear and have begun to listen to your own. The price of freedom is the discomfort of others. The price of strategy is the temporary loneliness of one who dares to leave the herd. Here, the call to action is unavoidable. Every time fear visits you, ask yourself if that internal command is worth obeying, or if the time has come to respond with a move of your own. Because the true strategist is not the one who lacks fear, but the one who has learned to use it as fuel for his own advancement. Fear is no longer your master. It is your tool. And with it, the board of power and influence opens up before you, waiting for your next move. Dare you look back? For it is there that you will see the true measure of your transformation. The days when you obeyed fear are now scars, not open wounds. You remember the imposed silences, the abandoned opportunities, the dreams you packed away with the excuse, "It's not for me." But something changed. The decision to stop obeying was not an outburst, but a succession of small acts of rebellion. Each "no" you uttered where before you were silent. Each step you took even when you were trembling. Every time, in the face of trembling, you chose to move forward instead of backward. Becoming a strategist is not a promise of invulnerability. Fear is still there, latent, whispering its old arguments. But you are different now. You are able to distinguish between the fear that protects and the fear that imprisons. You have learned to listen to that inner voice, not as a command but as a warning. If fear tells you to stop, you ask, why, for whom, what will it cost me to obey, and what can I gain if I dare to defy it? You have become the architect of your own destiny. Where once you saw orders, you now see choices. Where you once felt chains, you now discover tools. Because the strategy is not to eliminate fear but to use it as a compass. Whenever fear appears, you turn it into an uncomfortable but necessary ally. It shows you what really matters, what's at stake, what can still be conquered. But don't be fooled, the price of living like this is high. You will find that many will prefer that you remain a victim, because then they don't feel threatened. You will encounter resistance, rejection, attempts to push you back to the margins. But now you know that the margin is no longer a refuge but a voluntary exile. True belonging only comes when you dare to take your place, even if the ground trembles, even if your voice trembles. And here in this instant, I ask you a question that no one can answer for you. Will you continue to obey every command of fear, or will you dare to write new rules? The board is before you. Fear does not disappear, but neither does it rule. It is you who chooses the move. Because the real power is not in not feeling fear, but in not allowing yourself to be ruled by it. The call is not for you to become a hero or a martyr. It is for you to finally become the strategist of your own life. To use every fear as a sign, every doubt as a question, every limit as a frontier to explore. That you stop asking permission to exist, to decide, to influence. Because the day you decide to no longer obey fear is the day you truly begin to live. Now, in the silence after these words, there is only one movement left, yours. Do you dare to take it, or will you let fear decide for you again? The choice and the power has always been in your hands.